Stepson calls the pregnant wife a mistress only for her to realize the millionaire lied to her all along. Beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers and a carefully curated image of love and prosperity, Alison Morgan believed she had finally found the life she'd always longed for. Her new husband, Jacob Morgan, an influential entrepreneur known for his lavish lifestyle and polished charm, seemed like the consummate partner. Yet when Jacob's estranged teenage son, Daniel, arrives unannounced, he hurls a single devastating accusation at Alison. "You're just my father's mistress." Those damning words spark a chain of revelations that unravel every comfort Alison thought she possessed. Little does she know that the husband she idolizes has twisted truths and hidden a life she never imagined. Alison Morgan Nee Reynolds had grown up in a modest suburb outside Dallas, far removed from the glitzy life she would come to know. Her parents, Beth and Ronald Reynolds, were middle-class folks who prized stability and honesty above all. By her late 20s, Alison had held a string of steady marketing jobs, always dreaming of bigger opportunities but never quite finding that perfect chance. Everything changed the day she met Jacob Morgan at a professional conference in Austin. Jacob, introduced to her by a mutual colleague, seemed magnetic from the start. Tall, with dark hair flecked by a hint of silver, he exuded a confident charm that she had never encountered before. He told her about his tech ventures, philanthropic projects, and real estate developments in the city. As they spoke, she felt as though she were the sole object of his attention. For a woman who had spent years standing in the shadows of corporate corridors, the sudden, unwavering focus was intoxicating. Their courtship was a whirlwind. Late-night dinners in upscale restaurants, spontaneous weekend trips to the coast, and unexpected bouquets arriving at her office. Her parents worried it was all happening too fast. Jacob was nearly 10 years her senior, fresh from a complicated divorce and known to be well connected in high society. But Alison's heart soared. For once, she felt deeply desired and protected. She pictured her future shimmering with promise under Jacob's leadership and care. Within 6 months, Jacob proposed during a winter getaway in Aspen. The ring, an exquisite vintage diamond, sparkled against the snowy mountain backdrop. Overcome with emotion, Alison said yes. The wedding itself took place in a tastefully decorated garden venue near downtown Dallas. Everything felt like a dream: twinkling lights, clinking champagne glasses, and affectionate well-wishes from Jacob's many prominent friends and colleagues. Though small warnings tugged at her mind, like how Jacob deflected questions about his previous marriage or his estranged relationship with his teenage son, Alison told herself that every relationship had complicated backstories. After the wedding, they settled into a luxurious penthouse in Dallas's most exclusive neighborhood. The property boasted floor-to-ceiling windows, marble countertops, and panoramic views of the city skyline. Jacob encouraged her to resign from her marketing job, insisting she focus on philanthropic interests and life passions. "You have so much to offer," he said. "Why be tethered to a 9 to 5? And so Alison accepted this new chapter with open arms. Her days filled with yoga classes, volunteer committees, and planning glamorous parties that showcased Jacob's philanthropic side. She thought she was living a fairy tale until one sweltering afternoon, a ring of the doorbell changed everything. Standing at the threshold was Daniel, a lanky 17-year-old wearing a threadbare hoodie and dragging a frayed duffel bag. His gaze flicked over the posh interior, face twisting in distaste. Then cold eyes fell upon Alison, and he spat, "Nice to meet you, Mistress." The accusation, so casually delivered, jolted Alison like a lightning strike. She stared, speechless, as Daniel sauntered into the penthouse, as though it were his rightful territory. Her heart hammered in her chest. She didn't understand yet, but in that moment she sensed this confrontation was the crack that would tear her perfect life wide open. Alison stood rooted at the entryway, her mind reeling. "Mistress?" The word clanged in her ears. Daniel's stark hostility, so immediate and raw, shook her to the core. For all the stories she'd heard about Jacob's son, she hadn't expected this level of acrimony. Jacob materialized moments later, drawn by the commotion at the front door. His face paled at the sight of his son. "Daniel," he said, clearing his throat, I didn't know you were coming." His attempt at warmth faltered as Daniel cut him off with a raised hand. "Spare me," Daniel snapped, his tone dripping with teenage scorn. He dumped his duffel on the marble floor, ignoring the hush that spread across the living room. "I'm here because Mom kicked me out. She's done dealing with you and your perfect new life." His eyes flicked to Alison. "Or should I say your mistress?" Alison flinched at the word's repetition. She opened her mouth to protest, to explain she was Jacob's wife, but the confrontation was already spiraling. Jacob exhaled, frustration flickering in his eyes. "Daniel, calm down. Alison is my spouse." "Sure," Daniel scoffed, crossing his arms. "Did you tell her you never signed those divorce papers with Mom, or did you skip that part?" Silence crashed into the room like a tidal wave. Alison's gaze snapped to Jacob, confusion and fear knotting in her stomach. "What is he talking about?" she asked, voice trembling. She'd known about Jacob's divorce, but never suspected it might still be legally unresolved. That was unthinkable. Jacob's jaw clenched, and he turned to Alison, desperation in his eyes. "It's not like that," he insisted, placing a hand on her arm. "I'm legally separated from Daniel's mother, Brenda. The divorce is basically done. There are just a few final signatures." She refused to sign after the settlement dispute. Daniel barked, a humorless laugh. "Yeah, sure, Dad. Keep lying to everyone. I'm the one stuck in the middle." He kicked his duffel bag for emphasis. "Since Mom is furious at you for parading around with her placement, she tossed me out to prove a point. So here I am." Alison felt her pulse racing. Nothing in her quiet, stable upbringing had prepared her for this kind of drama. Could it really be that Jacob was never fully divorced? She tried to steady her breath. "Why would your mother do that to you, Daniel? This is complicated, obviously, but none of this is your fault." Daniel's gaze locked on her, brimming with resentment. "Don't pretend you care. I'm just the baggage in your twisted relationship." Jacob attempted to place a hand on Daniel's shoulder, but his son jerked away. A stifling tension flooded the room. The father and son stared at each other, a battlefield of old grudges and unspoken pain. Meanwhile, Alison hovered on the periphery, feeling as though her world had started to crumble with no warning. Finally, Jacob sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Look," he said, "you can stay here for as long as you need. We'll figure things out as a family." The last words sounded forced, as if he weren't entirely sure they were a family at all. Daniel rolled his eyes. "Whatever. Don't do me any favors, old man." He picked up his bag and trudged upstairs, footsteps echoing off the polished floors. Left alone in the foyer, Alison felt Jacob's eyes on her, pleading silently for understanding. But all she could think was, what else hasn't he told me? Suddenly, the penthouse, once a symbol of her dream life, felt like a labyrinth of half-truths, and she was only just stepping into its dark center. In the hours following Daniel's arrival, Alison drifted through the penthouse in a daze. She perched on the plush living room sofa, half listening to the steady hum of Dallas traffic through the glass windows. Jacob had retreated to his study, presumably to make frantic calls or plan the next steps. Daniel was upstairs in one of the guest suites. Door slammed shut. Alison's mind churned over the gut punch of Daniel's accusation. Mistress. She'd never considered herself that. She was Jacob's wife, He had proposed, they had married in a legitimate ceremony. She even had an official marriage license, so how could she be a mistress? Confusion spurred her to check her wedding documents. She rummaged in a desk drawer until she found the elegant envelope containing their marriage certificate. Yes, it was officially stamped and signed. There was no immediate reason to doubt its legality. But her relief was short-lived, overshadowed by a deeper concern. Was his prior divorce truly final? Jacob eventually emerged from the study with a somber expression. "Alison," he murmured, "we need to talk." She nodded, letting him lead her to the couch. They sat side by side, though a gulf of uncertainty yawned between them. Jacob took a moment, eyes fixed on the floor. Then he began, "Brenda and I separated a year ago. We fought over the property settlement, which complicated the divorce. I was sure it would be resolved by the time you and I married. But Brenda wouldn't cooperate. She refused to finalize anything unless I agreed to some outrageous alimony terms." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. "In my defense, I plan to tell you everything. I didn't want to burden you with these legal issues. I never dreamed Brenda would hold this over my head or that Daniel would show up out of nowhere." Alison's heart ached. She recalled all the times she'd asked about his ex-wife and how he'd always brushed it off with vague comments like, "The divorce is done in principle." She swallowed hard. "So, are you legally divorced or not?" Jacob exhaled a shaky breath. "No," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "Not on paper, but in every meaningful sense. Brenda and I ended long ago." Alison felt tears press at the corners of her eyes. Meaningful sense wasn't the same as legally divorced. That tiny distinction now threatened the legitimacy of her entire marriage. She tried to remain calm. "Do you realize how this looks? Especially to Daniel. He probably thinks I'm the reason you and Brenda split." Jacob squeezed her hand. "We'd been having issues for years before you, Alison. I promise you, I never intended for you to be in this mess." She studied his face, searching for sincerity. "But I am in this mess. And so is Daniel." Jacob lowered his head, guilt flickering in his eyes. "Yes, I'm sorry. Let's fix it. I'll talk to Brenda's lawyer again, see if we can expedite the final paperwork. We can prove to Daniel and everyone else that you are my legitimate wife." Before Alison could respond, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Daniel shuffled into the living room, ignoring them as he opened the fridge to rummage for snacks. The tension was palpable. How do you approach a child who believes you ruined his family? A wave of compassion rose in Alison alongside her own anger. She couldn't blame Daniel for resenting her if he thought she'd destroyed his parents' marriage. And so, for the first time since she'd met Jacob, Alison felt genuinely lost. The fairy tale illusions were cracked, replaced by a swirl of doubt and betrayal. She vowed to find a way forward both for herself and for the teenager whose entire world had been turned upside down, just like hers. But she also knew that illusions wouldn't magically restore themselves. In the coming days, she would have to confront truths that might shatter her faith in the man she'd married. The next morning, Alison awoke early, unable to sleep through the mental chaos. She tiptoed into the kitchen, where she found Daniel rummaging for cereal. He offered a single glance her way before resuming his search. Hoping to extend an olive branch, Alison cleared her throat softly. "Hey, Daniel," she began, voice gentle. "I can cook us breakfast if you like. Pancakes, eggs, you name it." He shrugged, not meeting her gaze. "I'm good with cereal." He poured the flakes into a bowl, then reached for milk, all without looking up. Alison swallowed disappointment. She could practically taste his resentment in the air. "I understand you're upset," she said quietly. "This situation isn't easy for any of us." At that, Daniel slammed the milk carton onto the counter, a flash of anger crossing his features. Stop acting like you know me, he snapped, turning to face her fully. You waltzed into my dad's life and took over, then tried to play the perfect wife. Now you're sad because you got caught. Alison's chest tightened. It's not like that. Really? Daniel scoffed, gesturing around the penthouse. Fancy place. Big ring on your finger, but no actual divorce for Dad. Seems pretty mistress-y to me. She bristled at the term, her temper flaring. I'm not a mistress, she retorted, more forcefully than intended. Your father asked me to marry him because we love each other. Daniel's laugh was hollow. You think you know him? Mom always said Dad would do anything to save face. He hates losing. And you, well, you're just the next piece in his puzzle. His words stung like whiplash, scraping across her carefully upheld illusions. She opened her mouth to respond, but was cut short by Jacob entering the kitchen, phone in hand, tension carving lines into his brow. Alison, I need to head out, he said, voice tight. Brenda's lawyer just texted me. Something about new demands. I'm going to try to settle this today. He shot Daniel a pleading look. You can stay here, or come with me. I'll stay. Daniel cut in, swirling cereal around in his bowl without real interest. Not like I want to watch you beg Mum for mercy. Jacob sighed, turning to Alison. I'll call you later, he said, planting a rushed kiss on her cheek. She nodded stiffly, still rattled from Daniel's outburst. When Jacob left, Daniel grabbed a spoonful of cereal, then paused. Don't hold your breath, he muttered, as if reading her mind. Mum's not going to let him off easy. A flicker of pain crossed his face, an undercurrent of hurt beneath the anger. Then he stalked off to the living room, leaving Alison alone with a swirl of conflicting emotions. She sank onto a stool, staring at the now closed front door. Jacob's attempts to finalize the divorce felt like a rescue mission for her own sense of legitimacy. Meanwhile, Daniel's accusations pierced her heart. There was more than just teenage rebellion in his words. There was the betrayal of a child who felt abandoned. She was starting to see that behind his hostility was a raw wound inflicted by both parents. And in the silent echo of the penthouse, Alison wondered if her life was built on half-truths. She'd believed so wholeheartedly in Jacob's love, but what if he had carefully curated a version of reality to sweep her off her feet? The thought sent a tremor of fear through her. She realized that while she sought a solution to Daniel's bitterness, she also needed to unearth the truth about Jacob. Before this, she had been content to trust blindly, but now doubt gnawed at her with relentless force. By mid-afternoon, Jacob still hadn't called or texted. Alison tried to busy herself around the penthouse, tidying shelves, organizing a closet, even attempting a yoga session, but her worry for the situation gnawed incessantly. She half expected Daniel to reappear with more barbed comments, but he remained sequestered in the spare room, presumably playing online games or stewing in his own thoughts. Desperate for clarity, Alison considered reaching out to someone who might know more about Jacob's history. However, Jacob's circle was composed mostly of business associates she barely knew. She thought about calling her own parents, but they'd been wary of Jacob's fast courtship from the start. Telling them the truth that he was still technically married would only validate their fears and worsen the tension. Then she remembered a name, Rebecca Johnson, a woman Jacob had introduced as an old friend from his college days. Alison had only met her once briefly, at a dinner event, but Rebecca had given off a warm, trustworthy vibe. Maybe she'd know something about Jacob's relationship with Brenda. Perhaps she could shed light on how it all went wrong. Digging through her phone contacts, Alison found Rebecca Johnson saved from that dinner. Summoning her courage, she dialed the number. After a few rings, a pleasant voice answered. "Hello? Hi, Rebecca. This is Alison Morgan. I'm not sure if you remember me. We met at that fundraiser dinner with Jacob a few months ago." A pause, then recognition flared in Rebecca's tone. "Alison. Of course, I remember. How are you?" Alison sighed. Honestly, I'm not sure how to answer that. I was wondering if we could talk. It's about Jacob and his ex-wife Brenda. Rebecca hesitated. That sounds serious. It is, Alison murmured. Can I buy you coffee somewhere? I need someone to talk to who won't be biased. Another pause. Then Rebecca's voice softened. Sure, I'm free this afternoon. How about we meet at Bellington Cafe near the Galleria? Around 4? Alison agreed, relief mingling with nerves. She left Daniel a quick note, meeting a friend, call if you need anything, and slipped out of the penthouse. The day was bright, the Texas sun beating down as she drove. Her mind whirred with questions. What does Rebecca know? Will she confirm or dismiss Daniel's version of events? Upon entering Bellington Cafe, a cozy spot with exposed brick and the aroma of fresh pastries, Alison spotted Rebecca, seated at a corner table. She was a stylish woman in her late 30s, with warm brown eyes and an air of calm assurance. As soon as Alison approached, Rebecca stood and offered a gentle hug. You look tense, she observed with concern. That's an understatement, Alison replied with a shaky laugh, sliding into the seat opposite. Once they'd ordered drinks, she dove straight into the messy truth: Daniel's arrival, the unresolved divorce, and her fear that she might be caught in a web of lies. Rebecca listened intently, occasionally biting her lip as though recalling her own experiences. When Alison finished, she exhaled. I wish I could say I'm surprised, but I've known Jacob for years. He's not a bad person, but he has a talent for burying problems instead of facing them. Alison swallowed. So, do you know anything about how he and Brenda ended? Rebecca's gaze fell to the swirling foam of her latte. It was messy. Brenda had her own issues: jealousy, temper, money fights. But Jacob, well, he wasn't always honest either. He'd pretend everything was fine when it wasn't, letting resentments fester until it all exploded. They separated at least once before, then reconciled. When they finally parted ways, nobody was sure if it was for good. A chill crawled up Alison's spine. He told me they'd parted ways a year ago, definitively. Rebecca nodded. They might have, but there were always lingering legal complications. And if Brenda refused to sign, well, it doesn't surprise me. She can be vindictive. Alison's heart pounded. So Daniel was right. In a way, Jacob had hidden the incomplete divorce. Daniel called me his father's mistress, she whispered, voice tight. He thinks I ruined his family. Rebecca's expression grew sympathetic. I doubt that's true, Alison. Brenda and Jacob had cracks for years. But I can't blame Daniel for being furious. He's a kid, stuck in the crossfire. He's probably parroted some of Brenda's accusations. Tears pricked Alison's eyes. What should I do? I feel so blindsided. Rebecca reached across the table, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. Don't let Jacob's omissions define you. He's good at persuading people the damage isn't that bad, but you're entitled to the truth. Demand it and figure out if you can still trust him after everything. Alison exhaled a trembling breath. For the first time since this ordeal began, she felt a shred of clarity. Yes, she thought, I need the truth, every last piece of it. Only then could she decide if this marriage was worth fighting for, or if she had married a man she barely knew. She thanked Rebecca, feeling both gratitude and unease swirl in her chest. The real battle for honesty had just begun. Alison returned to the penthouse just as twilight spread across the Dallas skyline. She found Daniel sprawled on the leather couch, watching a sports channel with a bored expression. He didn't bother looking at her when she entered. Everything okay here? She ventured, setting her purse down. Daniel shrugged, flipping channels. Your friend come to bail you out? He asked, sarcastically, eyes still glued to the screen. Alison sighed, deciding not to take the bait. She settled into a nearby chair. Look, Daniel, I'd like to clear up some things between us, she began, choosing her words carefully. I know you blame me for your family's problems, but I promise you, I didn't even meet your dad until after he told me he was already separated. Daniel's jaw set, and he paused the TV. Mom said he always had someone on the side, even before they were separated. That you're just the latest in a string of women. So excuse me if I don't buy the innocent new wife routine. A flare of hurt and anger twisted inside Allison. I get that you're upset, but I'm not lying about when I met your dad. If he deceived me about anything, I'm just as angry as you are. He eyed her skeptically as though testing her sincerity. So you found out he's not actually divorced? Yes, she admitted, cheeks heating with shame. He said it's a legal technicality. But, yes, it's complicated. Everything with him is complicated, Daniel muttered. After a moment, he turned off the TV entirely, swinging his legs to face her. Do you at least see why I'd think you're a homewrecker? Allison searched his gaze, seeing echoes of the father in his angular features. I understand how it looks, she said softly, but I never intended to hurt you or your mother. I fell in love with Jacob, believing he was free to marry. He looked down at his hands. Mum's not perfect, he admitted. She can be, intense. But Dad left us in the lurch. He said it was her fault, that she was controlling, but I saw him with other women even when I was younger. It's been a mess for years. Mum used to cry at night. A pang of empathy clenched Allison's heart. I'm sorry, she whispered. I never knew about any of that. He told me they had grown apart, that the marriage was over, but maybe he wasn't fully honest. Daniel's lip curled, though not with as much venom as before. He's good at telling people what they want to hear. I've lived with that my whole life. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken pain. Then Daniel spoke again, voice laced with bitterness. So you can see why I don't trust him or you. I'm tired of being lied to. Allison nodded. I can't force you to trust me, but I'd like to earn it if that's possible. I'm not the enemy here, Daniel. He studied her, arms folded. Finally, with a reluctant sigh, he said, You want to prove you're not a manipulative snake? Fine. Help me figure out the truth about Dad, about everything. Because right now, I'm stuck in this penthouse prison, and I have no idea what's real. Allison felt a flicker of hope. I do want the truth, she confirmed, for both of us. She hesitated, then gently added, and maybe, while we're at it, we can find a way to help your mum, because this can't be easy on her either. Daniel's gaze flicked away, but a spark of acceptance shone in his expression. Deal, he muttered, turning the TV back on, but don't expect me to be nice all of a sudden. Allison managed a small, wry smile, fair enough. She rose, heading to the kitchen to fix herself a calming tea. Their conversation had been tense, but it felt like progress, a tenuous olive branch in a field of landmines. And for the first time since Daniel's arrival, Allison sensed a fragile alliance forming. Maybe, just maybe, they could navigate the web of secrets Jacob had spun, as long as they stuck together. Jacob finally returned that night, looking haggard and sullen. The moment he stepped into the penthouse, Allison and Daniel were waiting. Allison had quietly convinced Daniel to hold off on further confrontation until they heard what Jacob had to say. Now the father stood under the cool glow of recessed lighting, shoulders drooping in defeat. Well? Allison asked, crossing her arms. Did you see Brenda's lawyer? Jacob nodded, setting down his briefcase. Yes, he murmured. It didn't go well. Brenda's demanding nearly half of everything, plus spousal support for 5 years. She's using the public embarrassment angle, claiming I caused her emotional distress. He raked a hand through his hair. If I refuse, she'll drag this out indefinitely. A storm of emotions whirled inside Allison, relief that he was at least trying, anger at how messy it all was, and a flicker of worry over the public embarrassment claim. She exchanged a glance with Daniel, who rolled his eyes but said nothing. After a tense pause, Alison spoke. Jacob, we need absolute honesty right now. This is more than just money. Daniel believes you cheated before the separation, and from what I'm seeing, Brenda might have a case for that if you were involved with someone else. Is there any truth to that? Daniel's gaze snapped to his father, eyes full of both rage and a desperate hope that perhaps he'd been mistaken. Jacob's face tightened. I never stepped out while Brenda and I were actively together, he insisted. We had an open separation for months before I met you, Alison. But yes, I'd grown close to a few other women after things fell apart at home. Brenda considered that cheating because we were still legally married. But in my mind, the marriage was done. Daniel let out a harsh laugh. So basically, you took the vow to forsake all others and tore it up whenever it suited you. Daniel, Jacob said, a flash of anger in his tone, you weren't around for the worst of it. Brenda and I were miserable. The fights, the accusations. It was toxic. I tried to keep you shielded from it. Daniel's jaw worked, tears threatening. Yeah, well, I ended up in the middle anyway. Alison stepped forward, laying a cautious hand on Daniel's arm. He jerked away but didn't lash out. Instead, Alison turned to Jacob. So Brenda's refusing to finalize the divorce unless she gets a huge settlement to punish you. And you never told me how precarious this was. Jacob exhaled. I'm sorry. I thought I could handle it quietly. I didn't want to scare you away when we first started. I was falling in love with you, Alison. Maybe it was selfish, but I thought the details would sort themselves out in time. Her eyes stung with unshed tears. She had left her entire life behind her job, her stable routine to build a future with him. Now that future teetered on the edge of a legal battle. We can't live in illusions anymore, Jacob, she said, voice trembling. We have to face this head on. And Daniel has a right to be part of these discussions. He's not just baggage. Jacob glanced at Daniel, who offered a sullen shrug. Fine, Daniel muttered. Let me guess. You'll say we should reason with Mom, or maybe pay her off. But that's not going to fix all the lies. Jacob's shoulders sagged as he met his son's gaze. Maybe it won't fix everything, but it's a start. I just want us to move forward. Alison felt the weight of their stares. She realized she was not just a bystander, but a pivotal figure in the resolution, if one was even possible. Let's at least try to find some common ground, she said softly. But deep within, she wondered if bridging the chasms carved by deceit was truly possible. The notion that she might forever be labeled as the mistress haunted her, and the seeds of doubt about Jacob's character continued to grow. Would love be enough to overcome this mountain of betrayal? In the days that followed, the penthouse became a tense battleground of uncertain truces. Jacob spent hours on the phone with his attorney, hashing out strategies to counter Brenda's demands. Meanwhile, Alison tiptoed around the edges, trying not to pry but desperate for any sign of progress. Daniel, for his part, settled into a prickly routine of half-hearted cooperation. He allowed Alison to prepare meals but rarely shared them with her at the table. Instead, he'd take his plate and retreat to the living room or his room, drifting in and out of the place like a reluctant ghost. One late afternoon, Alison mustered the courage to knock on Daniel's door. After a long pause, he opened it, wearing headphones slung around his neck. Behind him, the room was scattered with clothes and empty soda cans. What? He asked, not unkindly, just guarded. I thought we could talk more, Alison said gently. About how you're feeling, about your mum, about your dad, about all of this. He shrugged. What's there to say? I'm stuck here because Mum can't stand looking at me, says I remind her of him. And Dad is trying to act like everything can be solved with money. Meanwhile, you're in the middle and we all hate it. Alison bristled at the mention of hate, but swallowed her pride. I won't pretend I understand everything you've gone through, but I want to help if I can. Believe it or not, I don't like how Dad is handling this either. Daniel's brow furrowed. So why stay? If you found out he's still legally married, how can you put up with that? The question sliced through her carefully maintained composure. She hesitated, unsure how to express the emotional turmoil raging inside her. Because I still care about him, she managed finally. I married him for a reason, and leaving without at least trying to fix this feels like running away. He eyed her, a flicker of respect crossing his features. Ha! So you're not just some gold digger looking for a wealthy husband? Allison bit back a laugh. No. Contrary to what you or your mother might think, I never saw Jacob as a meal ticket. One, fell in love, plain and simple. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, his defensiveness easing slightly. Guess we're both stuck in a messed up situation. Mum's basically lost it. Dad's a liar. And he paused, eyes traveling over her anxious face. You're stuck in the crossfire. She gave him a sad smile. Yes, I suppose so. But we can still find a way forward. Maybe your dad can come clean about everything, sign the right papers, and your mum can move on. Then maybe you can have peace. He sighed. Doubt it's that simple, but whatever. He stepped back into his room. You can come in if you want. I'm just gaming, but I won't bite. Her heart warmed at the small invitation. She entered, carefully picking her way around the clothes and cans to sit on an unoccupied corner of the bed. Daniel resumed his game, occasionally explaining what was happening on screen. For once, the anger in his voice ebbed, replaced by a bored but mildly interested tone. Allison felt an uneasy gratitude, as if they had forged a fragile new peace treaty, at least for the moment. Down the hallway, Jacob's voice resonated through the study door as he argued with someone on the phone. Allison closed her eyes, listening to Daniel's chatter about the game's storyline. She wondered if this was how normal families bridged gaps through shared time and conversation, however mundane. Yet a knot of dread tugged at her. She sensed that the final confrontation with Brenda was fast approaching. And whether or not Jacob could free himself from his old marriage and the lies around it would determine if Allison was truly a wife or forever labeled a mistress. The stakes had never felt higher. Jacob called Allison into the study the next afternoon, shutting the door for privacy. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting bars of light and shadow across his desk. He gestured for her to sit opposite him, his expression grave. I spoke with Brenda and her lawyer again, he began, fiddling with a pen. We're scheduling a mediation session next week to try to finalize terms. Brenda agreed, but there's a catch. He paused, jaw tight. She wants to meet you face to face before we go into mediation. Says it's the only way she'll even consider signing. Allison's stomach lurched. She'd never met Brenda, but she had a vivid mental picture, an angry, betrayed woman convinced Allison had stolen her husband. The thought of confronting her directly was terrifying, yet a spark of determination flickered. Maybe a conversation could clear the air, if that's even possible. What does she want from me? Allison asked quietly. Jacob shook his head, exasperation in his eyes. She claims she wants to see for herself who you are, the woman who replaced her. In her words, she said something about wanting closure, or at least to gauge your intentions. Allison exhaled, her pulse thudding. And if I refuse, she'll stall the divorce again? He nodded bleakly. I'm afraid so. Folding her hands, Allison forced herself to remain calm. Then I'll do it. But I'm not going there to beg for her blessing. I just want the truth out in the open. Jacob hesitated, eyes flicking away. Allison, you should know. Brenda can be vindictive. She might say things about me, about how we parted, possibly about other women I dated during our separation. I don't want you blindsided. Pain stabbed at Allison's heart. So there were others? His shoulders slumped. A couple of brief flings, yes. I was lonely and angry after everything. None of it was serious. But Brenda might spin it like I was cheating on her. Just be prepared. Shame and uncertainty twisted inside Alison, but she forced herself to nod. Thanks for the warning. I'll listen to what she has to say, but I'll form my own conclusions. Jacob reached across the desk, trying to take her hand. I'm sorry you have to deal with all this. I know it's not fair to you. She pulled her hand away gently, tears burning her eyes. Fair or not, it's what it is now, she murmured. I just hope after we face Brenda, we can begin to rebuild something, if that's even possible. He looked stricken but said nothing. Sensing he had no more comfort to give, Alison rose and left the study. She retreated to the balcony, overlooking the sprawl of skyscrapers and highways. The city shimmered in the afternoon heat, oblivious to her turmoil. Leaning against the railing, she thought about Daniel, trapped in a no-man's land between warring parents, about Brenda, presumably seething with righteous rage, and about Jacob, cornered by his own deceptions. Where do I fit in all of this, she wondered bitterly. Was she simply the symbol of Jacob's betrayal, or could she still carve out a place as his legitimate wife? In that moment, the future felt uncertain, like stepping onto thin ice with unknown depths below. Yet she recalled her conversation with Rebecca Johnson, who had urged her to seek the whole truth. This meeting with Brenda might be the painful step needed to unearth that truth once and for all. No matter how much it hurt, Alison steeled herself to face the consequences of Jacob's tangled past. The meeting was set for a discreet cafe on the outskirts of Dallas, a quiet spot with private booths and soft lighting. Jacob had offered to accompany Alison, but Brenda insisted she speak to the other woman alone first. Reluctantly, Jacob agreed, waiting outside in his car while Alison took a shaky breath and stepped inside. Brenda Morgan was already seated, wearing large sunglasses and a chic black blouse. Even from across the room, Alison sensed an aura of tension crackling around her. Though Brenda appeared well composed, her rigid posture and tight jaw hinted at simmering anger. As Alison approached, Brenda took off her sunglasses, revealing eyes that held equal parts sorrow and bitterness. So, Brenda said, motioning for Alison to sit, you're the woman who thinks she's Mrs. Morgan. Alison tried not to flinch at the barb. She eased onto the seat, clasping her hands in her lap. My name is Alison, she said evenly. I'm sorry for the circumstances of our first meeting. Brenda's laugh was cold. Funny, you don't sound sorry, but maybe that's just me. Let's skip the pleasantries, shall we? I have limited tolerance for small talk these days. Alison swallowed, nerves jangling. All right, you wanted to meet me. What did you want to discuss? Brenda's lips curved into a mirthless smile. Where to begin? She leaned forward, eyes locked on Alison. You think Jacob is all yours, don't you? But guess what, legally, he's still my husband. He never finished our divorce. So you're not Mrs. Morgan. You're just a woman wearing a ring that means nothing in the eyes of the law. Alison clenched her fists under the table. I'm aware the divorce hasn't been finalized. He told me after the fact, and I'm not happy about it. If you refuse to sign, I understand that's your right. But you think I'm being petty, Brenda interrupted, eyes blazing. You assume I'm just a scorned ex trying to punish dear Jacob. Let me enlighten you. He lied to me for years, cheated on me with multiple women, all while claiming we were just having a rough patch. Do you know what that did to me? And do you expect me to just vanish quietly while he moves on with his fancy new trophy? The accusation stung, but Alison refused to wilt under Brenda's glare. I'm not a trophy, she said softly. I met him believing he was separated and on the brink of divorce. He never mentioned you two had ongoing issues or that he was involved with others before me. Brenda's expression briefly flickered with something like pity. That's Jacob for you. He sells illusions, tells each woman she's the only one who truly understands him. She paused. letting the words settle. Look, I don't hate you specifically, but I hate what you represent, the continuation of his pattern of betrayal. Alison leaned forward, desperation edging her voice. I understand your pain, and I'm not denying Jacob's faults. But Daniel is suffering. He's stuck between you two, confused and angry. Can we at least agree that he needs stability? At the mention of Daniel, Brenda's fierce facade faltered. Her eyes darted away. I love my son, she whispered, voice cracking slightly. But every time I see him, I see Jacob. I see the heartbreak. I'm not proud I kicked him out, but I couldn't cope with the daily reminders. Alison's heart clenched. Despite Brenda's hostility, she saw the raw wound beneath it all. He misses you, Alison said gently. He might not admit it, but he does. And he's angry at Jacob too, but he's living in our penthouse with no real sense of belonging. For a moment, Brenda's eyes filled with tears. She blinked them back swiftly. I don't know what you expect me to do. Forgive Jacob? Let him skip away with half our assets? No, I want justice. Alison felt tears prick her own eyes. Then take what you're owed, she said, voice trembling. But please, don't let Daniel become collateral damage. And if signing those papers helps end this legal limbo, maybe we can all move on. Brenda studied her, silent. The tension in the small booth was suffocating. Then her gaze hardened. I'll consider it. But I make no promises. Just remember, you may not be the only one wearing his ring someday. Jacob's loyalty is fickle. Alison closed her eyes, swallowing a knot of fear. She knew Brenda might be right. Yet she also believed that if there was any hope of rebuilding trust, it required confronting the past rather than burying it. For now, she'd accept whatever morsel of cooperation Brenda offered and pray that Daniel's future wouldn't be further shattered by the battle of his parents' secrets. Alison left the cafe feeling hollow, as though all the illusions she'd clung to had been stripped away. She found Jacob waiting in his car. The moment she slid into the passenger seat, he glanced over anxiously. How did it go? He asked, voice taut. Alison pressed her hands against her forehead, exhaustion hitting her full force. She's furious, Jacob. She feels betrayed, used, and humiliated. She might consider finalizing the divorce, but she's not making any promises. And she despises the fact that I exist in your life. She thinks you'll just replace me too, eventually. He winced at that. She's never going to forgive me, he murmured, pulling out of the parking lot. But it doesn't matter, as long as we can finalize everything legally. Alison stared out the window at the passing streets. It should matter. Maybe not her forgiveness, but at least some closure. She's hurting. Daniel is hurting. And I'm left wondering if I ever really knew you. Jacob's hands tightened on the wheel. Alison, I can't undo the past. Yes, I handled it badly. But we can build a future that's honest. I want that, truly. She said nothing, letting the quiet envelop them. Her thoughts swirled, revisiting Brenda's words about Jacob's multiple flings. Alison had to face the possibility that her marriage was built on a pattern of deception. Could Jacob truly change, or was she just next in line to be discarded? At the penthouse, they found Daniel pacing near the windows, phone in hand. Finally, he muttered, I've been calling Mom, but she won't pick up. A flicker of worry creased his brow. Did you see her, Alison? Yes, Alison answered carefully. She shared a brief summary, minus the most cutting details. She still loves you, Daniel. She's just going through a lot. His shoulders sagged. Sure, she kicks me out, but somehow she loves me. Right. Alison approached him, longing to offer comfort but unsure if he'd accept it. She's in pain. People do irrational things when they're hurting. Daniel gave a bitter laugh. Great. Everyone's suffering, so now we can all be miserable together. Jacob stepped in. Look, I've scheduled a mediation session with your mum's lawyer next week. We'll try to finalize the divorce. That means you can go back to your normal routine, or at least figure out a stable living arrangement. He paused, glancing at Alison. And we can sort out our marriage properly. Daniel barked. Marriage? You mean your pretend wedding or the real one with Mom? You never ended. Daniel, Jacob warned, but Alison gently touched his arm, signaling him to calm down. It's okay, she said. He has a right to be upset. She turned to Daniel. Your dad is going to do what's needed to end the old marriage. I promise if he doesn't, I'll be the first one out the door. Daniel's expression softened marginally. So you really would leave him if he keeps lying? Alison met Jacob's gaze. Yes, she said firmly, ignoring the flicker of hurt in her husband's eyes. I won't live a lie. Neither should you. For a moment, they all stood in the hush of the high-rise living room, the city lights twinkling in the distance. It felt like a fragile ceasefire. Daniel eventually nodded, though his posture remained guarded. Jacob shifted uncomfortably, as though balancing a precarious burden on his shoulders. All right, Jacob said, clearing his throat. Next week's mediation is crucial. Until then, we keep the peace. He tentatively touched Daniel's shoulder, but his son pulled away, heading to his room. As Daniel's door shut, Alison faced Jacob. We can't just keep stalling, she whispered. If your mediation fails, if Brenda refuses to sign, we need a plan, because I can't go on like this indefinitely. Jacob touched her cheek gently. We'll figure it out, he said, though a tremor betrayed his own uncertainty. I'll do whatever it takes. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that the man she'd fallen in love with was more than a charismatic deceiver. But the shadows of doubt loomed larger each day. And as the countdown to mediation began, Alison feared the final confrontation might reveal more than either of them were prepared to face. The much-anticipated mediation day arrived, tense and overcast with threatening clouds. Alison stayed behind at the penthouse with Daniel, while Jacob drove off to the lawyer's office downtown. The hush in the living room felt suffocating, as though the building itself was bracing for impact. How long do these sessions usually take? Daniel asked, sprawled on the couch. He sounded casual, but Alison noticed the way he chewed his lip, a telltale sign of anxiety. Sometimes hours, Alison answered, scrolling through her phone absent-mindedly. It depends on how close they are to an agreement. He nodded, eyes distant. If Dad finalizes the divorce, will you too? I don't know. Stay married? Her heart twisted at the vulnerability behind the question. That depends on what else comes to light, she said gently. I still need to know I can trust your father. I love him, but I can't build a life on secrets. Daniel grunted. Yeah, well, trust is not his strong suit. But maybe he'll surprise us. They lapsed into a strained silence. An hour trickled by, then two. Clouds gathered outside, and rain began to patter against the windows. The phone on the coffee table remained silent. Finally, close to midday, the elevator chimed in the foyer. Alison tensed. Daniel's gaze flicked to the hallway. Moments later, Jacob stepped inside, face drawn and weary. We have an agreement, he announced, voice tight. Brenda will sign the final divorce papers in exchange for a significant settlement. It's not cheap, but it's done. Alison exhaled, relief warring with apprehension. So, that's it? You're officially divorced? Jacob nodded. We still need a judge's sign-off, but the agreement is binding. It means I can finalize everything in the next couple of weeks. For a split second, Alison felt a wave of hope. This was the resolution they'd waited for. Then Daniel spoke up, arms folded. What about me? Did you figure out if I'm stuck living with you or going back to Mum? Jacob met his son's eyes. Brenda agreed that you can choose. If you want to stay with me and Allison, we'll formalize that. If you'd rather go back to her, that's your call." He hesitated. "But I hope you'll stay until you finish the semester, at least." "Your mother said she needs time," Daniel scoffed. "Right, she always needs time. But whatever." Allison sensed the swirl of conflicting emotions in the teen. He wants his mother, but he also resents her. Her attention then shifted to Jacob, who set a manila folder on the coffee table. "These are copies of the final settlement terms," he said quietly. "Brenda also wrote a letter addressed to you, Allison." Her breath caught. "Me? Why?" Jacob shrugged. "She handed it to me after the papers were signed, told me to pass it along. I haven't read it." Allison's fingers trembled as she reached for the envelope clipped inside the folder. She slid it out, noticing Brenda's neat handwriting across the front. To Allison, the real truth. Adrenaline surged as she carefully opened the envelope. Daniel looked on with a mixture of curiosity and dread. Jacob hovered uncertainly, as though bracing for another bombshell. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper, typed lines under Brenda's personal heading. Allison began reading silently, her expression shifting from tension to shock. Finally she finished, eyes brimming with tears. She swallowed hard, then looked up at the two men, father and son, both watching her every move. "What does it say?" Daniel asked, voice low. Allison exhaled, her hands shaking around the paper. She apologized, she said, voice uneven, "for calling me a homewrecker. She wrote that Jacob had betrayed her long before I came along, and that it wasn't my fault. She said that if you," she glanced at Jacob, tears slipping free, "if you truly value me, then you'll treat me better than you treated her." A profound hush fell, Jacob's face contorted with guilt. Daniel shifted, eyes glistening. The letter was a final acknowledgement from Brenda that Allison wasn't the cause of the original cracks in their marriage. For Allison, it felt like a bittersweet liberation from the label Mistress that had haunted her since Daniel's arrival. That's more generous than I expected from her," Jacob managed, throat tight. Allison set the letter aside, meeting his gaze. "So now it's up to you," she whispered, "to prove you're done lying, done running from problems. Because if you're not," Jacob crossed the room in 2 swift steps, gently clasping her shoulders. "I am done," he said, voice quavering. "I promise you, Allison, I will give you the honesty you deserve. If I fail, you have every right to walk away." She watched the sincerity in his eyes, wanting so desperately to believe him. Then her gaze flicked to Daniel, who wore an expression torn between hope and wariness. "We need a fresh start," Allison said, softly but firmly. "All 3 of us. That means addressing the hurt, being honest about the past, and forging a real family. Or we end this. No more illusions." Jacob nodded, tears threatening in his own eyes. Daniel shuffled closer, his guarded facade flickering. "Maybe we can try," he mumbled. "I'm tired of hating everything all the time." Slowly they drew together. Not a perfect family, not yet. But for the first time, Allison felt a fragile sense that they might shed the lies that bound them, forging a path toward genuine love and mutual respect. It would be a long, winding road, marked by scars of betrayal, but also by a newfound commitment to the truth. And that, she realized, was the only way to transform a broken situation into something real and lasting. Thank you for following Allison's heart-wrenching journey through the hidden truths and tangled loyalties of the Morgan family. From the moment Daniel leveled that damning accusation, calling her a mistress, Allison's world tilted on its axis, forcing her to face Jacob's omissions and question the foundations of their marriage. Yet through each painful revelation, she discovered her own reservoir of resilience, determined to protect Daniel's well-being and seek genuine love over half-truths. If this dramatic story kept you turning pages, if you felt Alison's heartbreak, Daniel's anger, and even Brenda's lingering sorrow, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more captivating tales of secrets, betrayals, and the power of redemption to light. Join our community of story lovers and stay tuned for even more unforgettable dramas where the human spirit triumphs against overwhelming odds. Thank you for reading and watching.